Good evening. Thanks for braving all the weather. This sounds like, it looks like it's a typical dinner weather for the Ottawa Centre. There's either snow or something, or freezing rain. Not very often great weather, but it's nice to have the turnout that we do have. I've known Ken since 1969, and I've been told not to give a few stories, so I won't talk about those. What I'd like to point out is, in the old days, some of the gray hairs here remember the good old days back at Quiet Site and places like that, and all the people that made the observers group work, a lot of them, well, I shouldn't say a lot, a number of them actually went into physics and astronomy. Almost none of them ever completed it. Those that did, that I can remember, are all doing it almost as an amateur, on an amateur basis now. And we're still the ones that still love what we're doing. I think some of those that actually tried to get in through the professional side as undergraduate students in astronomy or whatever, they've drifted off and away from it. But there's a few that have actually lingered about as amateurs even into their professional life. And Ken is one of them. We've followed his career, some of us, for the last 25 years, almost 30, 25 years or so. Slowly working his way up, and that's the way it's got to be done, because you've got to learn how to do it before you'll actually do a good job at it. And I think we all agree that Ken does a good job at it. So he's coming back, I guess, a little bit of memory lane. He says he's, how much bad luck he's got, but I think for some of us who work day in and day out on typical jobs, and you use astronomy as a release, it's kind of nice to have astronomy not just as a release during the evenings, but also during as a passion during the day. So let's introduce, welcome Ken back to Ottawa. We're very glad to have him back, and look forward to hearing his presentation tonight.
Thank you very much, Rob. Now, can you all hear me if I don't, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Right. But then I'm stuck here, see? And then it just goes downhill. But if I step out like this, then I can move around and get involved, and if you can still hear me, he's under instructions at the back to go like this if you can't hear. So I like to wander around. If I trip over somebody's feet, then it'll be very embarrassing, but probably worth a laugh. You're probably all expecting to hear some sort of caustic comment from this West Coaster. Rumor has it I lived here, it's all a lie. Really, I guess I'm a transplanted West Coaster, and you're expecting some sort of sarcastic comment about the weather and how you're having all this snow so many weeks before the solstice. So here goes. When I left Vancouver 3 days ago, it was sunny. And there wasn't a cloud in the sky, and it was 8 degrees, plus 8 degrees. And when I got here, it was overcast and snowy and minus 8 degrees, and it was dark.
Sounds like one of
Of course, it was 10:30 at night, so I'll give you that point for free. The rest of it was miserable. And I'd forgotten just how bad it can get around here this time of year. I guess you also tend to forget that when we were younger, Rob and I and a few others in the group, when we were still teenagers, we used to go out and observe. We used to go out when the weather was like this, heading off into the country to our various observing sites. North Mountain, which then became IRO, of course, and prior to that, the Quiet Site just west of town, and by the Defense Research Labs out there. And on nights like this, we'd head out hoping that it would clear. That's just how die-hard kinds of observers we were at that time. The weather tonight, though, falls or plays into my hands a little bit, because I think we might all say that it's a bit unlucky that the weather should be so bad tonight. Everybody would hope to have a nice, easy drive to the meeting, and maybe some people stayed home tonight because they just didn't want to brave all the snow and the traffic and so on. So we might say it's unlucky. Well, my program tonight is a little bit about bad luck. It's about all the things that go wrong with the best laid plans. It's about 30 years, the past 30 years that I've been in the business, and some of my, well, I call it my top 10 list of my worst possible observing expeditions, and the way that they've gone off the rails, the way the fickle finger of fate has worked against you, that sort of poke in the belly button from that guy in the sky, not the good Lord, but that nefarious, maleficent being known as Mr. Murphy. Everybody is familiar with Murphy's Law anything that could go wrong will go wrong. And no matter how hard you plan a comet observation or an eclipse expedition or a meteor watch or what have you, something always goes wrong. And I've had my fair share of ups and downs over the years. So I picked my 10 favorite memories of this over the last 3 decades. And I think the underwriting theme of all this is that while it's true that some of these programs, some of these ideas that I had and some of these astronomical adventures had some elements that didn't work out properly, in every case, in almost every case, a substantial, if not complete, part of the mission was realized. What I set out to do was eventually realized, if not completely, mostly so, despite the fact that something went wrong. So there's a silver lining to some of these stories I'm going to tell. And I should also say that in looking backwards over time, in some cases over 15, 20 years, I think they all, well, with 2 exceptions, and those exceptions will become obvious to you over the next 20 minutes or so, that with 2 exceptions, these things all are very humorous in hindsight. So we'll begin at the beginning then, the first of my 10 reminiscences, and it starts right here, not in this room, of course, but in this here town, Ottawa, because this is where I got my start in astronomy, as a wide-eyed, sky-buff, freckle-faced, acne, to be perfectly blunt, amateur astronomer in the summer of 1967. I joined the RASC the previous winter. A friend of mine in high school had told me about the RASC. He said it was the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. Not only that, it was the Ottawa Centre. It was even worse. It was a very, very long name. And he told me about it, and I joined up, and we went to a meeting together. I was so frightened, I was so intimidated, that I went there with a dark blue blazer and a tie and a notebook. But the meetings weren't all that bad. They were great. And some of the people who were at that first meeting that I went to in the spring of 1967 are in this room. Stan Mott, I think, is probably the person who sticks in my mind the most, because he was, of course, the librarian at that time, and he signed my membership card. So it does go a long way back. And as a new RASC member, I received all the publications. The Observer's Handbook, of course, was a big, thick book full of all sorts of numbers and figures and line entries and so on. Keep in mind that at this point, I was about 15 or so, or 16, and I knew a little bit where the planets are. I had a small refracting telescope. I was out every night looking at the sky. I didn't know which way was up, north, south, east, or west, and I get this Observer's Handbook in the mail, and it was pretty impressive. Very steep learning curve to figure out what it meant. But it was a forest of information that I eagerly absorbed. Then a few months later came the RASC Journal, and of course I realized that there's been a lot of water under the bridge regarding the journal since those days. I quite enjoyed it. I couldn't understand half of it, but I thought it was pretty prestigious that I should be getting it. And then finally, after a while, the most incredible publication of them all, the gem, the jewel in the crown, Astronauts. I didn't know anything about that. I wasn't expecting it. I didn't know what I was going to get from my membership. But when I got this little tiny typeset, you can imagine what it was like back then. These were the Gestetner days. You know, and these things would be mimeographed off by hand, you know. I opened it up, something about the observers group, looking at the planets and stars and meteor observing teams and lunar grazing expeditions and that sort of stuff. And this really captured my attention. And one thing in particular, that I don't know why, that really grabbed me was this business of meteor observations done by groups. And up until this time, we're now talking about late spring of 1967, there were 2 active meteor observing groups in Ottawa, one out in the Queensway area, which was the far extreme west edge of town, another group in the south edge of town. And because the city was getting so built up, the light pollution was bad, and so on and so on and so on. And they had received permission to use the Defense Research Board quiet site. I don't know what the quiet site sounded very cryptic to me. There was a new area west of town where we'd be able to set up an observing compound. And the folks and astronauts were looking for volunteers to help, and this next word is very important, configure the site. Configure. So the technical doublespeak existed even in those days. Configure the site. In other words, they needed help. So I guess I made a phone call to somebody. I don't really remember. I must have, because a couple of months later, in the summertime, a Volkswagen Beetle showed up in my driveway, my parents' driveway. And inside that car were names that to be honest, I'm sure most of you won't remember them. We don't go that far back. Some of you do. People like Doug O'Brien and Les McDonald and Rick Salmon. Those of you who are on the internet and want to learn about how the Canada-France-Hawaii telescope works, you'll see Rick Salmon's name on the CFHT website because he runs the place. He got to start here in Ottawa too. And these guys swooped down upon my parents' home and took me and my buddy from across the street out to Quiet Site to help configure the place. We beetled off in Doug's Volkswagen, and we got out there, and I'll never forget this. This was in late July, it's the beginning of the annual Perseid Run. It's like a salmon run, you know, only at meetings. And they were still setting it up. But out at the Quiet Site, there was a 20-foot radio telescope at one end of the site. Great big, huge, a couple of 100 tons in size. Great big thing. I've never seen such a big thing in my life. And we could use it any way we wanted to. It had been decommissioned. So Doug O'Brien was the electronics nut in the group. Took it over and just saw this as a wonderful place and a huge big area for him to try out his various electronic experiments. There was a small observatory dome made out of an old farm silo in cinder blocks, but big by standards that we were used to in those days, that contained a 4-inch unitron refractor, completely loaded with all the goodies that we had in those days. That was on the site. And at one end, this is all at the south end of the site, and a few hundred yards up at the other end, keep that in mind, a few hundred yards, more like 600-700 yards. Up at the other end of the site was our RASC compound, the part of the site which had been designated for our use. No power, no water, but a little flattened hilltop which used to contain the old foundations for an antenna system. It all cleared off for our use, and that's where we began constructing the now infamous, I don't know if anybody still remembers all this stuff, or if it's been passed down through generation to generation, but this is where we built the coffins. How many people have heard of the coffins? Which are the plywood amateur version of what had been pioneered out at the Spring Hill professional meteor observatory at the other end of town. And this is what we took a couple of years to build up, and then we began observing meteor showers in a very systematic, regularized way, and we became very well known. I should point out, the Ottawa Observers Group back in the late 60s and early 70s and on in, I think, for quite some time after that, were known all over North America for the quality of their meteor reports. And Les McDonald was the leader of that team, and then later on, after apprenticing under him for some years, I took it over myself. Well, that first day we showed up, and of course I was just a 16-year-old kid, thin as a rake, and they wanted to put us to work. I have to tell you, time out here for a second, that only 6 weeks earlier I had been in hospital. I'd missed the last month of school in the spring of 1967 due to appendicitis. And I was rushed to hospital. I had my appendix out. There were some minor complications. I had to spend some time in hospital. Pretty sick for a while, you know, quite weak, that sort of thing. It's not like today, where you have your appendix out at 10 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock that afternoon, you're back at work, right? Nothing to do with the medical end of it, more to do with the budget end of it. But in those days, you were sick for a week, and I was sicker than that. And I was told not to lift anything heavy for, you know, a couple of months or so. You know, it was dicey for a while. And we were off to the Quiet Site. And it wasn't until I got out there that I learned what the meaning of the term configuration was. The problem was there was no electricity at the business end of the Quiet Site. Let's say that that's this end of the room. And several hundred yards, 600, 700, 800 yards, 10,000 yards, 2 miles to that end. That's about a fish story, okay? Way down the other end where the radio telescope was, that's where the power was. That's where our tape recorders are going to be that we're recording. And that's where the CHU Canada time signals were coming out of. That we were going to record all our fancy meteor observations, okay? And at this end, on top of the hill, up here is where we were going to do the observing, and we needed to have a cable to stretch a microphone at the observing compound all the way down to the other end of the field to where the tape recorders are. Never couldn't figure out why somebody couldn't put a plug in up at this end, but that's just the way it was. The power was down there, and it wouldn't do any good to lie this coax cable on top of the ground, because every month or so, the DRB would send out somebody to cut the hay, a long hay field in between, and get all cut up. So we had to dig a trench, and the trench was partly underway amongst the elite members of the group when they decided that what they should do was put an ad in Astros and ask for some volunteers and see if anybody foolishly stepped forward. And of course they did. You're looking at it. And so once I glommed onto the idea that there wasn't as much astronomical glamour for the first, you know, that apprenticing as a new meteor observer required, you know, bending your back a little bit, I then, and they explained what it is they want me to do is to help dig this trench. That's when I grabbed my side like this. Well, you know, I actually was in a hospital not too long ago. And so there was this conference. There really was. There was a conference, and O'Brien looked at MacDonald, and MacDonald looked at O'Brien. They both looked at McKinnon, Peter McKinnon, who was president of the group not that long ago, I don't think. I blame McKinnon. He's not here, so I blame McKinnon for the whole thing. He looked at me. He said, "How long since you've been in the hospital?" And I said, "About 6 weeks." And he looked at me from top to bottom and said, "Give him the shovel." And so it is that my first summer at Quiet Site, my first real experience with the Ottawa Centre Observers Group out there in the countryside, my first experience under the stars, away from city lights, a blazing canopy of stars, a huge meteor shower, the strength of which I'd never experienced before, a magnificently appointed optical telescope in a dome, a radio telescope, a place to run our cameras and take pictures. And here I was, digging ditches. So it didn't start off quite the way I'd anticipated. But me and my friend and a few others, we did our appropriate apprenticeship and we got onto the observing, and I learned the ropes under these guys. They were very, very helpful after that opening few days or so. And I have to say that everything that I've been able to accomplish since then all traces back to those early days in Ottawa. There's really nothing like an astronomy club. Yeah, I guess you can learn it on your own. There must be lots of examples of people who are lone wolves out there to learn their astronomy on their own. But there's nothing like an astronomy club to help foster that interest and to make it grow. And I'm very, very fortunate to say that I started off that way, even though it began with a ditch. So, that was experience number one, and the other ones are somewhat shorter. They involve mostly to do with comets and eclipses. My life seems to have been somehow arranged around comets and eclipses. I've traveled all over the world to look for these silly things. And my travels almost ended just as soon as they began. In July of 1972, we had an eclipse that was remarkably close. You know, looking back on it now that I've had to travel all over the place, and you people know about this, I'm sure lots of people in this room have had to travel to some hard-to-get-to place to see an astronomical event. And the fact that we had a solar eclipse visible in the Gaspé Peninsula on July the 10th, 1972, so close to Ottawa, was just too much to pass up, and a whole bountiful of us got in our cars and we all drove off up to the shores of the St. Lawrence River and joined up with people from the Montreal RASC and the Quebec RASC and other kinds of interested people from all over. There were hundreds and hundreds of people all camped out along the riverbank. However, the morning of the eclipse dawned cloudy, of course. Murphy's Law. And most people were sitting there with just long faces. But me, a couple of friends, we were young, fearless. We don't want to sit around for this. Let's get in our cars and race off in the direction that looks most promising. And so we did. We found a back road, a gravel road, down some dark, deserted part of the Gaspé Peninsula. We drove for hours and eventually found ourselves on a very narrow road which was being worked on. It had been freshly graded with very deep gravel. This is important. The gravel was so deep that it was tugging at the steering like this a little bit, and they hadn't completely graded it out flat, thinned it out. But we were able to get through it, and it was looked promising ahead. And eventually we got to a spot where there was a huge thunder cloud on one side, a big system on the other, but in the middle of the sky it was basically clear. And that's where the sun was. And that's where the eclipse was. And by golly, we saw it. The whole thing, against all odds. This was striking. If we could have had a wide-angle lens, it would have been tremendous with these towering thunderheads on either side, perfectly framing this glorious silvery corona. We were so excited. Now keep in mind, 1972, okay. I don't know how much to give away. Early 20s, put it that way. I was the oldest one in the car, I think. And we were pretty exuberant, and we were lousy scientists. We weren't scientists at all. We were just kids having a good time enjoying the eclipse, and we were so excited, wanting to get back to the main camp to tell people about our good fortune, trade stories about the eclipse, that we didn't even wait around for the partial phases to complete themselves. We just jumped back in the car and speeded off down the road. The emphasis is on the word speed. A very short time later, the front right wheel of the car caught one of those lanes of gravel in that uncompleted road, kind of an S-curve of thick gravel. And so while 3 wheels of the car were going along at about 60-mile-an-hour clip, 1 wheel suddenly came to a stop. And the car careened to the right, took off into the air. We were first Canadian suborbital astronauts. The car did a slow roll, you know, like the space shuttle does shortly after launch, so that it's prepared to go upside down when it goes into orbit. Well, we went upside down, off the road, into a swamp that was forested, trees everywhere. If we had rehearsed it 10 million times, if we were Evel Knievel, we couldn't have gotten it right. We thread the needle without, of course, having any control of the vehicle at all. The vehicle went precisely between or among the trees without hitting any of them, upside down into the swamp. And we all crawled out with only minor cuts and bruises and massively deflated egos. And even as the car gurgled and blurbled its way out of sight, the partial phases of the eclipse were still ongoing. The sun overhead was beginning to pass behind cumulus clouds. You know how transparent they can be? You could see the sun through it. You could see this little bite out of the sun. We looked up and the eclipse was still ongoing and the car was sinking to sight. It was an incredible moment. No, I wasn't the driver. No, it wasn't our car. The rest of the story is a whole lot worse. Boy, were we in trouble when we got home. But my spirits on eclipses weren't dampened for too long. If you fast forward to less than a year later, into June of 1973, the story finds me on board a cruise ship off the coast of Africa. Now, I sometimes look back over my life and wonder why it is that today, with my soul mortgaged almost completely out of existence, no money to speak of, no hopes for retirement. I don't know what I'm going to do in 15 years from now. But back then, when I was 25, I could afford to go anywhere I wanted to. What the hell was I doing on a cruise ship off the coast of Africa when I was still in school? I still can't explain how it was that we afforded that, but we did. And we were cruising off the coast of Africa on board what I thought was an ocean liner, but which some of the more disaffected, wealthier Americans on board were constantly reminding us that really it was just a glorified ferry boat. There were cars underneath. And it would travel annually, weekly from Marseille, France, down to Casablanca. Oh boy, couldn't wait to stop in Casablanca. It was quite the exotic location for us at the time. And then we had received a special change schedule for the boat after that. We chartered the entire ship, and it went south from Casablanca down to about 19 degrees latitude, and it was supposed to rendezvous in the middle of just off the coast of Africa, right on the center line of totality. And this, of course, was the eclipse of June the 30th, 1973, which was billed as the eclipse of the century. And indeed it was. Almost 7.5 minutes of totality, the maximum possible. And even at our very young age, we realized that there would never be anything like this again in our lifetimes, and that we would go for it. There were people stationed in the Sahara, right on the coast, inland a little bit, where the eclipse was just marginally longer. But we were worried about dust in the atmosphere, and it was prohibitively expensive to join those expeditions. So we decided to go on board the ship. It had been advertised as having these newfangled modern devices called stabilizers, quite new at that time, which would keep the ship not only going forward, but very steady during totality. So you could take pictures. You could get scientific results. Well, we were on board the ship. Everything was going just famously, although it was pretty hazy. We were looking forward to it as amateurs, you know, snowbirds from Canada, as being at 19 North and seeing constellations like Scorpius and Sagittarius, like we'd never seen them before. But the haze on the horizon, the ocean humidity, created a wall of moisture above the southern horizon that was almost exactly compensated for our drop in latitude, so that the tails of Scorpius and Sagittarius still were largely obscured from view. And we were worried about this because the sun wasn't going to get much higher than this the next day. It was a morning eclipse. However, everything seemed to be set up just fine. The night before the eclipse, so this would be June the 29th, 1973, just before sunset, Ken here is lounging beside the pool at the back. This was a good-sized ship. Call it a ferry if you want, but it had a swimming pool. I thought that was pretty neat. Lounging at the back when he heard this loud rumbling sound, followed by a huge belch of black smoke that came out of one of the smokestacks. Smokestack on the left of the ship and on the right, not in line like this, but on either side. And out of one side of the ship, called boom, big black volcanic eruption. What could this mean? We found out shortly afterwards because the ship slowly came to a halt and began to roll ominously. It had blown an engine. And from then on, we were limping forward. From then on, this is not like NASA, where there's a problem with the shuttle. There's immediately a press conference, and everybody has to own up to what the heck's going on. This, in our case, was a war of silence from the bridge of the ship. They didn't want anybody to know just how serious the problem was. It was incredibly serious. They worked all night to keep the ship going so that we could limp inside the path of fatality, which we did the next morning, just barely, so that we witnessed about 5.5 minutes instead of the 7.25 or so that we would get in that particular part of the ocean. Now, if you think about it, a lot of people in this room with a lot of experience with eclipse chasing, I know, getting 5.5 out of 7.25 is not bad for running halfway around the world. You know, you pay your money, it takes your chances. But at the time, we felt pretty cheated. We felt pretty like hard done by, having seen only 5.5 minutes. And I learned later through correspondence that several of the people on board who were conducting serious experiments demanded their money back. I don't know whether they ever got it. I doubt that they did, but that's how upset they were. The problem that we had, in addition to the short totality, was that with the loss of the stabilizers, the ship was doing this back and forth. We tried to take pictures anywhere, and that's where it was on that occasion that we developed a portfolio of pictures that started with very short exposures that looked not too bad, and then longer ones, which later became dubbed as the cosmic football pictures, because the sun just looked like an ellipse because the ship was rolling. We couldn't take anything longer than about, half a second, I guess. And some exposures were 2 or 3 seconds, and of course they were ruined. Now, I have to digress here just for a moment. The most noteworthy memory of this whole thing is that there was a group of graduate students from MIT, and they set up this horrendously large experiment on one side of the ship that took up one whole side of the deck. Everybody was allotted their space. Masking tape was set out on the deck, and you had to stand in that space. Everybody would have an area about twice the size of the head table here, and that's your space. But you couldn't move away from that because there was hundreds of people and not that much desk space. The guys from MIT had one whole side of the ship between 2 sets of cabins, and they had erected with angle iron and electronics and God knows what, this huge big experiment. I've long since forgotten what it was supposed to do. Lots of heavy science in it. And it was a huge sort of erector set kind of apparatus that was an area about 1/4 the size of this room. Okay, so from about here that just occupied the whole deck. And they took several days to put it together. And it didn't work. It couldn't work because it depended critically on the ship being stable, which of course it wasn't. And so it was with some considerable shock, surprise, that about an hour after the eclipse was over, and people were all excited and so on, walked around the side of that ship and found that the apparatus was missing. It was gone. I couldn't see how they could take it apart that quickly. They didn't. Later on that night, at dinner, over many bottles of wine, it was gradually revealed that tens of thousands of dollars of equipment was merely chucked over the side in complete disgust by these. They were young too, and they were impetuous. It was less expensive to chuck it than try and get it back to the States another day. I'll never forget that. It was pretty wild stuff. So that was 1973. We got back to Canada, to Ottawa, and pictures. We gave pictures to the observers group meeting. Actually, I don't think they had meetings in the summer in those days. So I'm not sure when those pictures. Probably later on in the fall. But in the meantime, I moved to Vancouver, seeking my fortune out west. I had made contact with the people at the Macmillan Planetarium out there, and it was agreed that they would train me as a lecturer at the planetarium if I moved out there. I had some kind of track record going and seemed to think I could do the job, so I moved out there and wound up being going through a training exercise and being put up on the equipment and so on. Eventually found myself making $10 a show, running 3 or 4 shows a week, just fresh out of school. Now in those days, of course, money was different, and a job worth $10,000 or $15,000 a year wasn't bad for a junior employee in the planetarium. But I was earning $10 a show, and it wasn't much. And the planetarium director was scratching his head, trying to figure out what he could do to get me a little more work, because I showed a little bit of promise. He thought I had spunk, and I knew my stuff. And along, out of the blue, came this celestial messenger from deep space called Comet Kahutek. And many of you in the room, even those of you who don't go back that far and never actually saw it, will certainly remember that this was billed as the comet of the century. This is incredible! The eclipse of the century followed by the comet of the century the same year. I thought, boy, am I living a charmed life. And of course, we know now that the comet fizzled out. And that's the dark side of that particular story, that the comet never did pan out, although It was, at that time, it turned out to be the second best comet I'd ever seen. Only Comet Bennett was better than Comet Kohoutek at that time, in my experience, going from the late 60s to early 70s. It wasn't a bad little object, but not a, it was billed in the newspapers as a, as you're driving home in rush hour at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in late December, this thing would be standing up like a searchlight above the traffic. Well, that just didn't happen. But what did happen is that the planetarium started getting many, many phone calls. And the planetarium director managed to squirrel some funding, managed to get some funding that had been squirreled away in a different part of the budget. He opened what he called the Comet Desk, which basically consisted of an old oak desk that had been discarded by the museum, set aside in a corner office with a telephone, and me installed in it. And I was hired for a few months to answer the phone about Comet Kohoutek. Ta-da! Hello, Ken, Comet Desk. And I answered, I boned up on the Comet, everything to do about comets. I answered the phone for some time. But things started to go awry. I became increasingly disenchanted with the number of, well, at the time I called them crackpots, cranks. But it's simply a part of our cultural fabric that when big celestial events occur, particularly comets, that the cultists come out of the closet. We know what happened with Comet Hale-Bopp, that tragic circumstance last year with a cult following. Well, it's been that way all along for thousands of years, of course. The comets have been viewed as portents of doom. And in those days, it was some character who called himself Moses David and the such and such and such and such. And he had this brochure, this pamphlet printed up, which we got at the planetarium. And it talked about the 40 days and the 40 nights. And somehow got the parabolic elements squared by the hypotenuse and the diameter of the moon going across the sky when the comet. And anyway, the Earth was going to end. The world was going to stop. And I got more and more phone calls about this. And I got just totally fed up with it. And finally, one day, you must remember, I'm new on the job. I've never been involved in the public eye before. And a reporter from the CBC shows up at the planetarium. He wants to interview me on camera. Great. And on top of that, he was a well-known reporter. He was a guy who had a very high reputation in the Vancouver area, and I was intimidated that this particular character should want to interview me. Comes upstairs, sets up the camera, sits down. The very first question was, what do you think? Is it possible that comets can control our destinies, that they have some direct influence on our daily lives? And I just could feel a slow boil coming. And I counted to about 10. And I leaned forward and I said, well, it got me this job. I wasn't happy with that answer at all. Well, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Comet Kohoutek got me that job, but a different comet cost me another job later on. Well, it wasn't really the comet's fault, but I'll tell you the story and you decide. This Comet Desk business, I did fairly well with that, and it led to a position at the planetarium called Education Coordinator. It was a full-time job. First one I ever had. It's like having a new car, for the first time as a kid. And I was in charge of education programs at the planetarium. And the snag, and this has an important bearing on the story, the snag was that I didn't report to the planetarium director, who was a cool guy. He was my mentor. He taught me everything I ever knew about planetariums, a lot about astronomy. Great guy. But I reported to somebody down in the museum down below us, in the main Vancouver Museum, because I was hired somewhat on the under the table under a federal museums grant for education people. And they said, well, we need a museum education person upstairs for the planetarium. And in order to make this work in a legal sort of way, I had to report to a museum person who was in charge of artifacts, not an astronomer, not the planetarium director. And this museum person didn't really have anything to do with the planetarium, didn't care one way or the other about the planetarium. So it was a bit of an uneven situation, and I didn't get along well with this guy. So a couple of years go by, we come to March 1976, and then really and truly, if not the comet of the century, one of the great comets of the 20th century did appear, and that was Comet West. And unlike Comet Kohoutek, which had all the hype and hoopla because it was supposed to be visible at 4:45 in the afternoon in December, which is a good, decent, civilized hour to have a comet visible, Comet West and a telemetry to be visible at 4 o'clock in the morning when nobody's up. And so it got no press at all, despite our best efforts in the planetarium. Nobody was interested, but we were interested. And we learned about the comet rather late in the game, shortly after it had reached perihelion. And we found out that this thing was shining about magnitude 0 or something. And we couldn't believe it. And of course, Vancouver at that time of year is like the biblical 40 days and 40 nights. It just rains day after day after day. And we realized that the longer we waited, every day that we waited past perihelion, the farther the comet would recede from Earth, the fainter it would get. We really wanted to see it. And so me and a few of my buddies, a bunch of guys got together, about 6 or 7 of us, and we said, if it doesn't clear up in 24 hours, let's race for it. Let's go chase it down. And so we went out, we rented the van, split the cost. We could never do this now. But back then, we were crazy. We rented the van, got in on the day, in the afternoon, it was pouring rain, about 2 degrees above 0, Celsius 0, in Vancouver. Just bucketing downpour, typical average Vancouver day. And got in this rented van with a bunch of telescopes and headed east over the mountains. Of course, as soon as you get to the mountains, the rain turns to snow. We're all over the road, risking life and limb. It's a miracle we weren't in an accident. We actually got stuck several times. Spent the entire night driving over the mountains. Got as far east as Princeton, which is about, well, in that snow, it was about 4.5 hours drive away. At about 3:30 in the morning, completely cloud over, still snowing, turned around, came back up into the mountains, and saw a little break in the sky towards the east, just as twilight was appearing. We ditched the truck on the side of the road in the snowbank, ran down this old sort of laneway, partway up a hill to see if we could gain some altitude, because the mountains were so high to the east, we needed to get a little bit of height. Didn't work, didn't see the comet, crack in the sky wasn't big enough, stuck in the snow, terrible mess, hundreds of dollars in debt. Horrible, 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 horrible. Got home, didn't come home, went straight to work. Looked a mess, looked awful. Tiptoed into work, hair was all like this. And there in the hallway, got upstairs, planetarium, there in the hallway was my good buddy David Dodge, who was a technician at the planetarium. And he was dangling in front of me an 8x10 black and white picture of Comet West in front of him. And he didn't get it off the internet in 1976, did he? He had developed the picture downstairs in the darkroom. He had taken the picture himself that morning. He had set his alarm for 3 o'clock in the morning, had gotten up, walked 6 blocks across the city park. The sky had cleared off completely. He set up his camera on a tripod and took a picture, came to the planetarium darkroom, developed it, and then waved in front of our eyes. Good morning. And I could shoot him. Our luck got a little bit better the ensuing weeks. We developed this system. We got a kind of a carpool going. What we decided to do is, this comet was so incredible. It's kind of ironic when you think of it. Comets that are really, really bright, you know, the really best comets, like a Comet West or a Hale-Bopp, are so great that you can see them from the city. But because they are so great, you don't want to see them from the city. You want to see them as far away from city lights as you can. They're so delicate. So beautiful. You want to get that perfect picture with the comet rising with a fir tree in the foreground, or something like that. And that's what we did for 2 weeks straight. We observed the comet rising in the east about 3:30 in the morning. We would go to bed at 10 o'clock at night, set our alarms for 2, get up, drive up to the east end of the Fraser Valley, about 2 hours worth, take pictures of the comet rising, some of which I still have to this day, and then come back and limp into work. These were all planetarium guys, you know, technicians, lecturers and so on, other friends and so on. But the only one of the bunch of us who actually had to appear in public was me. I was the school show coordinator. I had to look the part, and I didn't. The hair was all messed up, sort of like this, half asleep. And I realized that. But I thought, well, I'm up there, you know, I gotta go and look at the car. That's me, that's what I have to do. And I have to say, now, all these years later, that I feel pretty darn good. What we did was we went out to take pictures of the comet. We would develop them in the darkroom at 8 o'clock in the morning, half asleep. You know, we were 25. You could go without sleep for a couple of days. I can't imagine that, but we did. And we developed the pictures, and then we put them in the projectors and showed them in the planetarium school shows that same morning. And we would say, look, kids, this is the way the comet looked a few hours ago. Now, today, in 1997, you take that for granted. You pull an image off the internet, pipe it through a video projection system and onto the dome. If you work in a planetarium, it's not special. It's expected of you. But back then, I thought that was pretty neat stuff. But the guy I reported to in the National Museums of Canada wasn't so sure. What he noticed is not the pictures of the comet. He noticed that it looked like hell. I didn't look professional. And so I was hauled on the carpet one morning. And I looked particularly bad, I have to say. We really, just, running on 3 or 4 hours sleep, or, a week straight. And he said, you look a mess, and this isn't professional. I said, oh, it's true enough. But then the kicker, he said, all this chasing around the countryside looking for comments has got nothing to do with your work here at the planetarium. And so, without counting to 10 this time, I simply upped and quit right on the spot. So that comment cost me my job. And I had to start all over again. The planetarium director, the very next day, rehired me as a lecturer at $10. Well, it was about $12.50 a show by this time. And I had to work my way up the ladder all over again. And I was successful. It took me a long time, but it eventually worked out because I was appointed director in February of 1988. So I must have done something right then. But it took a long time to get back up on my feet after that. And so I think I have to look back and say that comments, I've had this sort of love-hate relationship with comments over the years. Well, we go forward now. We're getting forward in time to 1979, I think is the next spot. And don't worry, you're not going to be here until midnight because there's a big gap coming up here. But in 1979, I went on what was, I think, my 5th or 6th eclipse expedition. I have now been on 7 eclipse expeditions in my life. And all of them have worked out except one. And ironically enough, the one eclipse I missed was the one that was closest to home. The one eclipse that was so close to Vancouver that I could drive to it in my own car with my own telescope, my own big telescope. When you go around the world to Australia or on a stupid boat off Africa or whatever, you take binoculars or some small spotting scope or just a camera perhaps, but you don't have an opportunity. How many people in this room have seen a total eclipse of the sun through a 10-inch or larger telescope? That's what I wanted to do. I had a 12.5-inch, and my buddy, Alan Miller, who used to be a member of this group back in the late 60s, and who's still a neighbor of mine at the Okanagan, he had a 14-inch reflector, and it weighed about 10 million pounds. Huge, great big astrographic mount, twirl any way you want without any obstructions, and designed for photography. We wanted to look at the corona in great detail. Each of us had seen eclipses through binoculars and cameras, been there, done that. We really wanted to study it, like we'd never seen it before. And the fact that the so-called Goldendale eclipse, the one that would go right over Goldendale Observatory in southern Washington State, was only a 7-hour drive from Vancouver on February the 26th, 1979, gave us the opportunity to get this heavy equipment to the observing site, which we did that morning under a completely overcast sky. What Alan and I did, and here's the lesson. If you're thinking of going to the eclipse next winter or off to Europe in 1999, this is the eclipse. You're going to go chase them, and chase them to the end. Don't stop. The moment you become not mobile, you've lost the day, unless the weather is absolutely perfect. Alan and I took the risk that by setting up these semi-permanent telescopes and not being able to move around at the last minute, we took the risk that we would get our clear sky. And there was a crack of blue along the eastern horizon. We saw the sun rise and go up into the cloud where it stayed the rest of the morning. The rest of the people in our party, there was about 15 of us working as a group, all stayed at the same hotel the night before, a big party and all the rest of it. They were all mobile. They just had binoculars. They abandoned us and went down the road right into the town of Goldendale, about 10 minutes drive, and they all saw it. And that night, at the victory party, Alan and I were the only ones with long faces. Biggest telescopes, shortest view of the eclipse. So I guess there's a lesson to be learned in that. Let's forget it. I guess I can redeem myself a little bit. This is jumping out of sequence here, but in the Mexico eclipse in '91, the weather condition, the weather prognostications for Baja in Mexico were so good that I thought I would try one more time breaking the rules. And I took a 10-inch telescope for that one which would be very difficult to move in the last minute. The skies were flawlessly clear, and I was able to see the corona under high magnification, and it was phenomenal. Well worth the 20 years waiting from the very, very first eclipse.
7 minutes.
The one in Mexico, we got 6:06. 6:06. And the people down the road from us, I'm getting off track here, you'll never get home. People down the road from us, a couple of big groups, one of them from the Calgary RASC. Can we dig a little at the Calgary RASC tonight? They set up they had to be on the center line. We were off center line, cost us about 18 seconds or so on totality. They were right on the center line, but they're on the windward side of the spine of mountains that goes down the center part of Baja. The winds came up, the orographic effect kicked in, the winds raced up, moisture condensed, it was cloudy. They missed a good chunk of it in that area. I never would have done that. But then I said I made a mistake earlier at Goldendale, so we all make mistakes in these things. So we'll go forward. There's a long gap in the proceedings now. I have one memory from the 1980s. Now don't equate me with some old rock star whose memories of the 1980s has completely disappeared because of drug abuse. It's not like that. Very busy at the planetarium, hard-working, not much money. There were eclipses to go to, but they were in the South Pacific and things like that. I couldn't afford to do that. And there were no bright comets. As everyone here is aware, there was a complete dearth of comets from 1976 to 1996. So there wasn't much happening in a way of super events. But I do remember, I had one very fond memory of the Perseid meteor shower, and I have to be honest, I can't tell you exactly what year it was. Who was talking about records earlier tonight? My records for that are lost, but it was in the early 80s, and my girlfriend of the time and I were in Banff Provincial Park, and we had gone to a campground, and we were going to stay up all night and watch the Perseid meteor shower. We found this big, huge empty field with just the fir forest all around us, 100 yards in each direction. We set up our van right in the middle of it, set out our sleeping bags, foam mattresses right in the middle. We started watching meteors, had a little tape recorder going. Everything was going just famously until in the middle of the night, we heard the grunting and groaning. No, I hadn't fallen asleep. Grunting and pawing of a real live Ursa Major. And it was pitch black, and all we had were observing lights. Well, I had this little flashlight which had a white beam for emergencies. My girlfriend said, "This is an emergency. Shine that light, find out where that critter is." I said, "It'll ruin our dark adaptation." She said, you're going to be dark adapted and dead if you don't operate that stupid light. And so she says, "I'm getting out of here." And she got up and she made for the van. And so I said, "Well, I guess this is maybe what we should do." And we got out of the van, and sure enough, the bear was hard on our tails. So it was right there, obviously interested in who we are and how tasty we might be. And so we sat in the front seats of the van, and there we were peering up to the windshield. This is just horrifying. We were, frustrating. We were peering up to the windshield. This actually happened. Peering up to the windshield, and meteors were coming out, whoosh, like this. Whoosh, and the windshield started getting steamed up. Maybe something else was going on. No, we were looking up, and so I said, "This won't do." And she said, "We're not going back outside there. We're just not." I mean, you can laugh now, but I mean, you hear about people getting mauled by a bear. So I said, "I have an idea." Got out of the van, went around to the back, and where the spare tire is hitched to the back door of the truck, we used that as a kind of a step ladder, and up on top of that, and onto the roof of the van. We hauled up our sleeping bags. There were all sorts of, climbing around and on our hands and knees, and it was very painful. Everything, all the gear up there, and from the top of the van, we succeeded. We didn't see any more of the old ruin. We got our meteor shower perfectly throughout the course of the night, and it was just a beautiful vantage point, that extra 5 or 6 feet up in the air. Unfortunately, I had to shell out $350 some odd the following week to get the dents out of the roof. You haven't asked whose van it was. It was a friend of mine. It wasn't my truck. That's why I had to pay the bucks. If it was my truck, I would have left the dents in there. But that actually happened. So now we do have a long break, and I haven't got much longer to go because I take you now up to almost the current time, into the 1990s. In 1991, I finished my tenure as director of the planetarium. It was 4 long years of slogging away with paperwork, fighting City Hall, a losing battle trying to get funding. I find it ironic that the year that I left the planetarium, they embarked on this massive fundraising campaign at long last to raise money to refurbish the place. They raised $8.5 million. It only cost $1.5 million to build the place in '67. And they just reopened it a couple of months ago under the new title of the Pacific Space Center. But I just couldn't wait that long. And there's a new sort of emphasis at the Macmillan Planetarium. It's really on astronautics and space exploration. I'm more interested in pure astronomy. So it was going in a direction I didn't like. And I left and decided to get out of the city. Instead of chasing comets and eclipses, well, eclipses, there's not much you can do. But instead of driving out into the countryside for dim events, I wanted to live out in the sticks, out where the stars, where the Milky Way arches over my house every night. And so I moved to the Okanagan in 1991, And then I became much more active in astronomy again and started getting involved in volunteer activities and took over the organization of the Mount Cobalt Star Party, which I'm sure everybody here has heard about. Not nearly as big as the Starfest near Mount Ford. We get 200 or 300 people a year, not 800 or 900. But it's a well-attended star party and very, very popular. And I took over after several other people had done the organizing for years on end. I took over, it was my turn, in 1994. And that year we were lucky enough to have the great guru of telescope making, John Dobson himself. And he was to give a talk under the main tent. And John Dobson was in his late 70s at the time, he's in his mid-80s now, and he did heroic duty. He refused, like me, doesn't want to use a microphone, he wants to get out there and do this kind of thing. But in the middle of his talk, or shortly after he began, a huge wind came up. You are at Mount Cobalt, 6,600 feet up, on the summit. There's no protection. John's been there. He was there the year that it snowed in August. It was awful. Well, it was great. It was awful. He had to be there. Dobson was there, and his voice kept raising higher and higher and higher until it cracked. We had a microphone system right there that didn't work. So he braved, sort of soldiered on through his talk. He was talking about telescope making. Those of you who know this man know he doesn't want to talk about telescopes. He wants to talk about cosmology. Now the universe was made out of absolutely nothing. It's fascinating talk. And what happened, I'm the MC. And I'm sitting there like this, and I'm looking, hoping the hell that the tent doesn't come down on top of us. And I mean, seriously, really worried, because it was blowing like crazy. It was a massive windstorm, blowing in clear air, as it turns out. So later on that night, it was fantastically clear. Halfway through the proceedings, a colleague of mine comes running into the tent, breathlessly, with not standing on any kind of ceremony whatsoever, just interrupts Mr. Dobson at the top of his lungs and screams at me at the front. I was standing there, like this, off to one side. Dobson was talking. Ken, your telescope is blowing over. Say what? I have a 17-inch Dobsonian reflector, great big plywood monster. And apparently the wind had picked it up and carried it and knocked it right over. Bolus, the whole works. So we had a hasty end to that session. We ran up to the summit. Ken's you're looking at a guy here who's the ultimate diehard. It's no good getting just near the top of a mountain. I got to be at the top, right at the cut-off summit. I was at the area where they were going to build the Queen Elizabeth II telescope in the 1960s until they changed their minds. Which is a whole other story. I'll have to invite me back sometime. And I was right at the very top with no protection, all the wind. Other people are sort of, they're in the lee at the little, hilltop or something where they can be protected from the wind. I'm right at the top, and generally I park my telescope so that the ass end of the telescope is facing the wind. So when the wind hits it, it doesn't hurt, okay? The massive part is facing the wind. Just absent-mindedly, I had it turned around the other way this time. The nose end of the telescope was facing the wind. The wind picked it right up, ass over tea kettle like this, and off down the side of the hill about, maybe from here to the middle center table, which is a long way for a telescope to fly. Got up there, pulled that tarpaulin, which was sort of wrapped all around it, and this high-tech green garbage bag, which I use as a lens cap on the front end. Looked inside to see how the mirror was doing. I didn't have very far to look because the mirror was lying right there in front of me at the front end of the tube. Okay? It had gone wonka, 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 wonka down. Do you know what that sound is like? Wonka, wonka, wonka. I wasn't there to hear it. That's the second time it happened. It happened at Quiet Side, Rob. You might remember it when my 8-inch reflector, remember the old one we called Bertha, when the mirror went boom, boom, down the tube? It happened again with an 18-inch mirror, went all the way down the front. It was not cracked or broken. It wasn't even scratched. It survived the whole journey. The rest of the telescope was a mess. Cracked open, plywood pieces stretched right apart, screws laid bare. But of course, some of the best telescope makers in Western Canada were on the mountain at the time. And it was a case of, all the king's horses and doctors. I was at nursery and trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together. They got it together well enough that I could get it back into my truck and off the mountain, but not well enough to get it actually working again that night. But I was able to glue it back together with screws and wood glue and duct tape and all those, and chewing gum or whatever. I'm not a telescope maker, it's awful. And so today, the telescope survives. It looks like a battered warplane, all tarped up in the front yard of my house up there in the Okanagan outback, ready to be unleashed. It looks like hell. Looks fine in the dark. You just don't want to see it in the daylight. It's really a mess. But it still works. It still operates. And I'm going to come back to that in just a couple of minutes for my final story. It has a central role to play in my final story. And my second final story, number 9 on Ken's list. This is the difficult one, but I want to tell it to you anyway. Out of the blue, as you're all aware, we made reference to it earlier in the annual report section of the meeting. Out of the blue, in early 1996, shot from the cosmic depths, comet Yakutaki. It was amazing that a comet so big and so bright came so close to us. It came so quickly. And when you think of it, it was like a bullseye. In astronomical terms, it was headed right for the Earth, really. It was a very, very narrow miss on a cosmic scale of things. It all happened very quickly. And before long, we realized that we were getting set for a tremendous treat. That this long drought, if you're like me and I just live by comets, I've seen over 100 of them now. It doesn't matter how dim they are. The big telescope, I go out, 10th magnitude, 11th magnitude, I go look at them. But I yearned, like everyone else, for the big one. And finally, after 20 long years, a bright comet was on its way. And we didn't have to wait a long time. Remember, we already knew about Hale-Bopp. We were told we were going to have to wait, what, a couple of years for this thing to come around. But Yakutaki was discovered on a Wednesday, and it was going to be bright on a Thursday. You know, that kind of, it was going to come in a matter of weeks. And so we got all the telescopes ready, the big old Warhorse 18-inch, a 10-inch reflector, an 8-inch telescope that I used for taking pictures, tripods, cameras, binoculars. Went out and bought new binoculars for Comet Yakutaki, all set to go to see this pristine celestial visitor out here under the dark skies of my country home. It's one of the reasons why I moved out of the country. But as it turns out, there was a complication. And it lay in the form of a dear friend of mine, someone I'd known all my adult life, one of my closest friends. The wife of my best buddy was dying of cancer. And we had visited her just a week previous. We had watched the comet for a while, down in Libra, moved up through Virgo, heading towards Boötes, Arcturus. And just as it was attaining naked eye brilliance, but before it reached its maximum, we went to visit my friend in Whistler, BC, the ski town where they live, because I just wasn't sure when I would get to see Linda again. And she had been sick in bed for a week, unable to really do very much. But that night, at 3 o'clock in the morning, when the comet came around to that side of the house, just above the constellation of Libra, still only about 3rd magnitude, maybe a 3 to 4 degree tail. But after all, Whistler is such a small place. It's almost perfectly black, even right in town. So it was a beautiful sight. And she got up, and I gave her the binoculars, and she held them up very unsteadily like this. And she said, "Oh, that's incredible." She had been observing the sky almost as long as I had, and it really meant something to her. It energized her so much that the next day she got out of bed, and she took us all to brunch. She was pretty wobbly. She was very sick. But she made it, and I was astounded by this. And so we left Whistler. We said, "We'll see you in a couple of weeks. We'll come back, and we'll keep going." I had to go through Vancouver and do a couple of days' work in Vancouver, and it was frustrating, it was agonizing to know that this comet was getting so bright and so good, and here I was tied up with all this light pollution and stuff. I couldn't wait to get home. I eventually did on that night when the comet was just south of the constellation of Boötes. I'm sure most of you could have a picture in your mind what this was like. If it was, I don't remember how clear it was in Ottawa, but we started getting some very good forecasts around that time in BC, and it looked like we were going to get a glimpse of the comet almost every night. And we were all set up with our gear, ready to go to investigate a comet in detail in a way that I just never been able to do ever before in my life. And then we got the phone call that nobody ever wants to get. We're at the hospital now, Ken. She's taken very ill. We've gone to Vancouver. We're at VGH. It's happened rather suddenly, I'm afraid. I don't know if she's going to be able to get out again. And so we had to make a decision, and really there was no decision to make. I knew what the priorities were. He's my best buddy. He needed me there. So the decision was made. We would return to the Big Smoke. Leave the telescopes behind and the cameras, and off to the city, to the hospital, where we would begin the vigil to bid my friend goodbye. And it was amazing, really, because for 3 or 4 nights in a row, the skies were clear in Vancouver. Do you have any idea how rare that is in the springtime in Vancouver where it rains? That's where all those gorgeous flowers and blossoms come from in April, is that it rains like hell in March in Vancouver. And yet we had 3 or 4 clear nights in a row that we were at the hospital in that last week of March, each night we would go up to the roof of Vancouver General Hospital, about 12, 14 floors up, whatever it is. And up there they had a place, it's kind of funny really, when you think of it. There's a place out there on the roof of the hospital, a big glass enclosure that they set aside for the smokers. And that's where they go in and they have a smoke. And off to one side of that, there's kind of a patio area where you could be right on the roof, completely outside. And we look up and there we could see the comet. And it was easily visible to the naked eye, where, for those of you who know Vancouver, you realize that VGH is just south of the main core, the downtown core, on Broadway. And it really is in the heart of the second, third largest city in Canada. And we can see the comet with the naked eye, just a tiny little stub of a tail. And we brought binoculars. I even had a little handheld telescope, a little RFT telescope in my lab. And nurses could see it. They come out. What are you doing up there? Well, we're looking at the comet. And you know, everybody had heard about it. Everybody. And they had all traipsed out, and some patients and so on. And we had this little star party going out on the roof of the hospital. It was absolutely amazing. And we look at it through, you can see the tails. But in my heart of hearts, and this is a difficult confession to make, but I'm only human. In my heart of hearts, I'm saying, gosh, I'd like to be home now. I'd like to be out there, 50 miles to the north of here, out in the bush, and see this comet out in its natural habitat. And here I am, stuck in the city, watching from the deck of this hospital room. What's wrong with this picture? Well, and of course, there was an awful lot wrong with this picture, and I had to rise above these petty concerns of mine. On the night of the 24th of March, 1996, when the comet came to its closest approach to Earth, and you'll recall, I hope, that it was a very unusual configuration. I just can't believe how it worked out. You would have noticed it here, of course, but more so in BC. We're 5 degrees farther north than you are. And there, at about 2 o'clock in the morning, the comet would be directly overhead within an hour or two of its closest approach to Earth, right at the zenith point. It would be a stunning sort of configuration in the sky. And of course, a couple of nights later after that, it went very close to the North Star. And the tail stretched completely across the sky. Just a little bit before midnight on the 24th of March, my friend began to slip away. And I lost it. I ran out to the roof of the hospital. I did, you know, what a lot of people do. They go up and I shook my fist at the sky and said, how can you do this? Well, life's like that. We lose people this way. And I saw the comet, and this was about 1:45 and at that point the comet was very, very close to the zenith. And I realized it was within a couple of hours of its closest approach. And it was so bright, and the sky was so clear that night, that even here in the middle of the big smoke, that thing was commanding everyone's attention. And I looked up at the comet, and it occurred to me in my emotional state, admittedly not a scientific or rational moment for me, but in my emotional state, it occurred to me that the comet was poised, indeed parked, almost as though it was parked on purpose directly above the hospital, ready to take the spirit of my friend away, ready to bear her safe passage heavenward. And you know, a few minutes later, it did. And it was the most incredible moment in my life. You know, comets, what can I say? In my life, I've seen hundreds of them, I've seen 800 of them, half a dozen really bright ones. To me, they're like exclamation points. And for some reason, they seem to have punctuated important aspects of my life. Getting a job, losing a friend. They just, for some reason, have bookmarked exceptional moments in my life. And even as I was watching the comet that night, on that dark night, metaphorically speaking as well as literally, in Vancouver, of course, the best, brightest, biggest, most fantastic and well-publicized comet of the whole century was on its way in, and that was Comet Hale-Bopp. And I vowed that I would get a better opportunity to see Hale-Bopp with all my equipment than I did with the Kentucky. In fact, I was very fortunate. At this time, Cosmic Highway television series was starting to come online, a series that now appears on Discovery Channel in reruns. And we were conducting interviews of astronomers around North America. And one of the people I was lucky enough to interview was Tom Buck, the co-discoverer of Comet Hale-Bopp. And he confided to me what everybody knows now, I guess, if you've been reading the magazines. He said, you know, I'm just an ordinary deep sky observer, the big reflecting telescope. I know my sky really well. I know all the M objects. I looked at M70, the globular cluster in Sagittarius that night, and right next to it was a little fuzzy thing. And I knew right away it didn't along. And going over to the start charts to check to see if it was supposed to be there, he says, I knew in my heart it wasn't there. I knew that, but you had to go through the motions. And of course, you know the rest of the story. He discovered the comet. And it reminded me, I thought to myself, gee, you know, I could discover a comet this way. Anybody in this room could find a comet that way. We just got lucky. And it was a lesson to learn that, you know, I have this bad habit of when I go to observe the sky at night, I'm always looking for new, tricky objects, things I've never seen before, and I ignore those time-honored objects, you know, Messier 38, Messier 67, or whatever it might be. So I've been there, done that. But you know, it sometimes pays to keep a little watch here and there on those celestial objects that you think you know so well. You never know when you're going to see a little intruder to one side that might be a comet with your name on it. And so with this in mind, this past summer, and now leading to the final bit. This last summer, I gave myself a little observing project. I wanted to take a look at those hard-to-see Messier objects that I hadn't seen in many years because they're too low to the southern horizon. So normally I would attempt this, say, at Mount Cobalt when you're 6,000 feet up and you got a nice clear southern horizon. But this was after the star party was over. We'd had a terrible summer, lots of cloud. You know, here comes a confession from a Westerner. We had a cold, wet summer. The temperature hardly ever got anywhere near 30. And lots of moisture. Global warming is arriving. It certainly hasn't hit the Okanagan Valley, I can tell you that. And I decided we got a good forecast at the very end of August as we're heading for the Labor Day long weekend. I said, I'm going to pick off these globular clusters. The very one that Tom was looking at that night that he found Hale Bob. I'm going to pick them off for myself in between the tree branches on my property. It's going to be tricky. It's something to do. Let's just try it, see what we see. And so I think it was the 29th or 30th of August. And I went out, my telescope is tarped up. This is the old battered warplane I was telling you about. It's tarped up out in the front end of my yard about, if this is the wall of my house, the telescope would be about where Rob is. Okay, so it's a little distance out. I go out there, it had not been untarped in weeks, okay? And out in the country, if you don't untarp your telescope for weeks, you got to expect things. You know, there's, you know, bugs out there, and spiders, and hornets' nests, and ugly things like that. Worms and stuff. I went out, and, you know, you got to brush it off and all that stuff. And it was sunset, after sunset, getting a little bit dusky, hard to see. And I bent down to pull the shock cords off the thing, to release the cords, to unwrap the tarpaulin. And my telescope rattled at me. There was a Pacific Northern rattlesnake under my telescope. How did I know it was a Pacific Northern? Because I was so darn close to it. It was so darn close to me that I got a good enough view of it that I could compare it against a picture in a book that I have, whose title is Critters You Never Want to Meet. That evening, briefly, I held arm's length negotiations with the critter to see if I could entice it to move along. It would have none of it. No more doves, thank you very much. I suppose what had happened was that the weather had been so unseasonably cool and damp that the snake had slithered along and it found the tent-like enclosure underneath the telescope very inviting. It was warm, it was dry, it was out of the way. They don't like people or action of any kind. He just curled up and decided he'd sleep for a couple of weeks. And so there he was. Well, I wasn't up to poking away at this guy as it was getting dark, so I retreated, used my binoculars on the patio, and then went to bed, had a jittery night's sleep. The next day, I got out there and said, oh look, we got to do something about this guy. And I went out there, and I got a long stick, very long stick, and I lifted up that tarpaulin on the front end of the telescope, you know, the eyepiece end of the telescope. I said, oh, and there he was, all curled up like a little chunk of rope, right underneath. You know, if you want to drop a plumb line from the eyepiece, that's where he was. Okay, about there. So what I did was I got a big bucket of cold water, like a galvanized pail of cold water, and I had arranged my stick. You know, it's funny, he didn't move. It's like, are you alive in it? And I lifted up the curtain, like the skirt of the tarpaulin, just enough so I could see this critter was there. And I got a big bucket, and I threw the water at him. That annoyed him. It annoyed him so much that he uncoiled himself, but instead of moving off, he went and reworked himself right underneath the base of the telescope. You know, underneath the rocker, the rocker attaches to the main pilot platform. I was then sitting on a series of concrete blocks, and he just went right underneath it. It's a sliver of area about this big, just big enough to allow a big fat adolescent rattlesnake to get under. And he went under there. He said, well, it got wet out there. I think I'll move under here. And so I didn't know what to do. I couldn't get at him. I couldn't poke the stick under there. I couldn't get the water under there. And he just stood there. So there was no observing that night either. Next day, with renewed enthusiasm, I went up there and I said, well, you know, this is the third day. Now, he's probably gone by now. They don't like interaction with people. He's probably had time to think about this, to whatever extent they can think. And he's probably moved off. So I went out there and I sort of gingerly, sort of very slowly, out into the telescope circle, got my stick, sort of lifted up. Oh, I don't see him, I don't see him. And I went around to the front of the telescope. Oh no, there he was again. He had moved out from the protective area underneath the rocker, back out to his preferred area. It was a little roomier. You could sort of move out underneath the front end of the telescope. And I tried the bucket thing again, and same thing happened. He went underneath. So I waited a few hours. This is the morning. I waited a few hours, and I was really getting antsy, and I came back just before sunset, and I thought, what can we do here? And I went out to the telescope, and I was just standing there. I said, are you in there? You know, I'm getting braver. He hadn't attacked me yet. I was just standing there. At that moment, I hadn't noticed it, but one of our two cats, you heard the expression, curiosity killed the cat? One of our two cats comes up. This is Scooter, named after the blemish of the atmosphere of Neptune. So because he showed up at our house during the Voyager. Never mind, it's another story. Scooter, who weighs 18 pounds, is the smaller of the cats we got. What you doing, Dad? You know, what you got going on there? I said, Scooter, you shouldn't be here. This is dangerous. At that very instant, the snake poked its head out from underneath the tarp, about this much. Right out, with his tongue like, you know, little snake radar. What's going on? Complete pandemonium. The cat arched its back like this and froze. I fell back out of the telescope circle into the sagebrush, and the snake darted back underneath the tent. All three of us were petrified. No observing that night. Third night. Day number, this is all true. I'm not making this up. Day number 4, enough, okay? And I have to tell you, you're probably wondering, you're sitting in the back of your mind, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, why don't you do something really drastic? Why don't you go up there with a shovel? You know what? That was never an option. Because you see, the rattlesnakes out there are not quite an endangered species, but they're darn near that way. We, you know, our subdivisions and so on, the Okanagan have moved out into their territory. The snakes are becoming increasingly harder to find. People hunt them down for nothing, no other reason than the hunt, the thrill, and to get the rattles and take them home as a trophy. It was never an option to bring harm to the creature. We're in his territory. There has to be a way of negotiating this thing through. My idea of negotiation was to get another bucket of cold water and put this much gravel in the bottom of it. Gravel, I scooped it off our driveway, threw it at the bottom of the pail. So this would be water with shrapnel in it, okay? It wouldn't really hurt it, okay? It wouldn't kill it or anything. And I waited, and I waited, and I waited until he poked his head out, and then I just went, whoosh, like that. That did it. That absolutely did it. Now he was the snake equivalent of scared. And he slithered off. Oh, boy, he was long. He was like this. And I tried to count the rattles. There were 8 or 9 or 10. He was an adolescent. We get him bigger than that. And I saw him go over at the cinder block circular walls of my little enclosure and off into the bush like that. He disappeared. Great. Observing tonight. Alas, true to Murphy's Law, a couple of hours later when the sun dipped down, this giant wall of cloud arched up overhead, drawing the lid closed on the Okanagan night. That was it for that night. It started drizzling about midnight, and it was cloudy for 3 or 4 more days. Then the crescent moon came up in early September. That was it for those low-lying objects in Sagittarius. Maybe next year. I hope so. And so, that brings me just about to the end of my program. I think I can safely say to you then that in looking back over 30 years of astronomical observing at home, abroad, various adventures, that I've had my fair share of ups and downs. Murphy's Law is intruded to its full extent, and yet it's been an awful lot of fun, and with those 2 exceptions of rolling upside down in the car and this my friend, I don't think I could say that I would have anything done over in any different way. They do create for me a lot of fond memories. I'm now looking forward to the next in my list of astronomical adventures, the eclipse in the Caribbean next February. About 8 months ago, when we were still in production with Cosmic Highway for our first season, we began plans for doing our second season. And one of the things we decided to do was an episode on solar eclipses. And what we were going to do is take a member of the regular general public and bring them along with us and take video coverage of this person freaking out during totality. And we would get a first-hand view of what it's like for an average person who's never seen anything like it in their lives, what their reaction would be for a total solar eclipse. That was back early last June, and we were getting ready to shoot for our second season, beginning with a run over to Europe, and Stonehenge, and other places. We had our plane tickets in our hands when, on June the 13th, a Friday, as it happens, word came down from the east, from Toronto, the center of the known universe, that our main funding agency had overstepped, had gone over budget by more than 20%, and had all its assets frozen, so that our production had to go on hold until the next budget year opens up next April the 1st. The eclipse, meanwhile, takes place in February. And there is a policy in place for many of these funding agencies that you cannot do principal photography prior to your application being reviewed. So right now, as of this moment, we have asked for special dispensation. Since Mother Nature can't move the eclipse, we have asked to see if we can go shooting. We have contingency funds from last year. We go shooting before we actually make an application to do the shooting. We've been told over cold beers in a dark corner of a distant restaurant in a conversation that never actually took place, this request shall be favorably looked upon. And so we're still hoping to go to Curacao. Now, of course, the most recent bug in the works workup is, will the volcano blow or will it not blow just in time to ensure that the eclipse is eclipsed near the Caribbean? Who knows? We'll find out soon enough. The only thing that I can tell you for certain is that I've had a heck of a lot of fun with my astronomical adventures in the past 30 years. And as we get closer now to New Year's of 1998, I look forward to the beginning of my 4th decade in pursuit of astronomical happiness. And I think it will forever be that way. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ken. I think I'll use this. I don't boom as much as you do. That was great. It brought back a lot of memories to me. I've been a long-time member of the Center as well. I joined in 1970. I can't believe that. That's, well, I was 11 or 12, I guess, at the time. It was an awful long time ago. And I can clearly remember the first meeting, you talking about meteors and talking about galaxies and things like that. So, it's as clear today, 27 years later, as it was then. So many of those stories, I guess I've long forgotten, but they came back to me. The story of the eclipse was something. Wasn't the name of the boat the Monte Yumbe? Or was that the one Rob was on? I can't remember, but that was the one Rob was on.
It'll come to me. Long enough.
Massalia.
That's right. All of that sounded familiar, and I can clearly.
It's an African term meaning rolls a lot.
And I still remember the slides you had of that eclipse, and I remember the frame, and it showed in one corner the moon, or the eclipsed sun, and then down in the other was the other part. So it was just like a long thing stretching from one corner to the other. And it was artistic, I guess, just how you managed to do it that way. But it was wonderful. Many other things as well. I clearly remember a lunar eclipse one night out at Quiet Site, and the rest of us, I mean, sensible people, were watching the eclipse, and you were facing the other way. This was a great opportunity to get an hour of meteor observing then. I don't know, it was 2 weeks till it was dark again, but for some reason you had to pick that, that hour that was more important than watching the eclipse. I think you've described something I think a lot of us who were young at the time truly wished we could have done. For us, it was a hobby, and we thought this would be something that would be nice to find a way to make a living or at least survive that. And not many of us were able to do so, but you were able to do so, and you still seem to be getting along just fine in this. And I think it's an inspiration, something that I guess during times when we wish we had more time in our hands to do more observing, we can look back and see that there's some people who have managed to do a great job of it. And even if we can't live a lot of these stories ourselves, I think just hearing them helps us with our hobby. And thank you for talking to us tonight. Thanks, Ken.
I think, given the lateness of the hour and the road conditions exterior, we won't have a formal question session, but Ken will be here for a while, and drive safely on the way home.